Welcome to another episode of the Ecommerce podcast. My name is Simon. I'm here with Dayu, and we've been in the cross-border e-commerce industry for a decade. Both of us have been on a different journey, and we want to share our experience from both our angles. Dayu more from a brand perspective, and myself more from a logistics perspective. One thing that we are discussing with our clients continuously is how do we create operational efficiency. One of the things that is coming up all the time is production batching. It's a very relatively simple concept, but easily overlooked. And the advantages are truly enormous. Most e-com sellers are just not even aware of this option. That's why we're making this episode. Tune in for more. Another episode, we're going to talk about production batching. Maybe to give some context, how does it work? What is production batching for the audience?
Yeah, so production batching, it's something that has to do with optimizing your production, and it's actually a lot more advanced than I think even what a lot of more advanced brands and supply chain managers are used to. I have a strong opinion that you're probably thinking about China fulfillment the wrong way. You're probably utilizing and getting the benefits from China fulfillment in the wrong way, or at least not unlocking all of the benefits. A lot of the folks, look, everyone in the industry sees Shein, they see Temu, and it's very obvious that a big part, at least what's obvious of their ability to grow so fast is because they ship, or at least they started shipping almost all from China to around the world. But that's only a portion of what actually makes them so optimal. Companies have been shipping from China for actually decades, direct parcels, or at least more than a decade. Why didn't Wish succeed, for example? That was based on shipping from China. So it's not just about the shipping. I have a lot of experience in supply chain, and typically a lot of supply chain decisions or options are more based on small optimizations. You save 5% here, you gain 5% efficiency. And by the way, 5% is a lot. However, if you do it the right way, including your production planning, then that's how a company like Shein, something like Temu, and some of our most successful clients are really optimizing and fully utilizing the benefits of shipping from China. And you could actually see like a literal 10x improvement on your inventory risk, on your ability to get it to market faster, and just smoothing out your production planning and smoothing. So what production batching is, a lot of our clients, especially if you're more used to a traditional freight model, the limit of how you can optimize for your production planning is going to be stuff like, I'm going to order 50,000 units. So you get like 10 cents saving on that batch. Or the other way around is, okay, I want to minimize my inventory risk. So I want to just purchase the factory MOQ of, let's say, 5,000 pieces. Those are all valid, especially if you're actually having to ship containers to the US with longer lead time. But a big part of the benefits of direct from China parcel shipment is the extremely short lead time from your factory to, let's say, our warehouse in Shenzhen. And it could be days or hours sometimes. And what that enables is the ability to actually get super dialed in and go to an extreme in terms of planning your production, not just in terms of larger or smaller quantities, but actually break down each step in your production process and optimize for each, and actually be able to potentially purchase more at lower cost, but actually reduce your risk. And there's a lot of nuances there that we will actually go over. But Simon, one of the things that we talked about before was a term that I really like. You called demand chain, right? And how the ability to be able to ship from China and the lead times and also a lot of the potential efficiencies of China production because of that actually allows brands to change how they think about supply chain planning. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what demand chain is and how that fits into all of this.
Demand chain, I would say, comes from e-commerce, because technically e-commerce, it's hard to predict what your demand is going to be. You're going to put a product online not knowing what is going to be the orders today, tomorrow, next week, or a month from now. That means that brings complexity on the supply chain because it's hard to predict. Nobody has been successful in predicting their orders in Q4. And you easily sell out or you have too much of it. So the demand chain actually, the concept came a little bit from around the COVID time, because actually there was a demand for products that were not available. So how do you actually fill that demand instead of push a supply? That made a really big shift in the concept of supply chain towards a demand chain, how do you actually fill a demand that with limited supply? So that means that you have to actually go much further than the warehouse of where you're putting the supply in. You have to go not just to the factory, but even to the suppliers of that factory to be able to fill that demand, and then make it as flexible as possible. And Dayu just mentioned, like, our warehouse in St. John is maybe an hour away or a few hours away or maybe a few days away. What is even more important is that the China infrastructure is centered around the factories. Everything you need to produce is nearby by a reason. So most of the regions are also, the concept are, these factories, they only produce, this region only produces plastic related, or maybe another sort of raw material that's the foundation of the finished product. That means that the factory also can have their supply within a few hours, within a few days. That infrastructure is helping significantly for them to be able to ship within a few hours, within a few days. Obviously, a lot of the products, the raw materials, they have an MOQ, just like you have an MOQ with your factory, and that creates a lead time. But how do you solve that lead time is actually not pushing the factory and saying, look, I have a full container load or a 50,000 and I need them to be ready in 5 batches of 10,000 pieces. And you as a seller are going to say, okay, I'm just going to pay whenever you send me these 10,000 each. The factory is going to say, wait, you're committing to 50,000. I'm going to get the raw materials for 50,000, but you're only paying me per 10,000? That doesn't make sense. Then the risk is all on me. So if we flip that discussion with the factory and saying, look, I'm going to buy for you all the raw materials you need for the 50,000. Tell me how much it costs. Probably 10%, maximum 20% of your finished cost of goods. Then you take that risk out of their hands, and then you tell them, please send me 10,000 pieces every week to, let's say, Ecommerce warehouse, and I'll pay you the remaining 80%, 90% before it's leaving your warehouse. That is a game changer, because suddenly the factory is no longer responsible and taking the risk on the supply, what they need to produce based on your demand. And even if that demand is wrong, what is really the risk of losing that 10% or that 20% for a much higher potential upside that is still controlled, because it's still 1 month worth of supply that you've purchased, in this case 1 month, or it could be whatever you're comfortable with. It doesn't mean your supply, you're not going to sell the product ever again. If you're a reliable brand, your orders might not be completed, then your demand might not be as predicted, but you will sell out over the months afterwards. So the risk is actually much more limited by having this more like demand chain, optimized supply chain, whatever name you want to give to that.
And one question I actually have for the viewers here is, have you ever seen an accurate sales forecast? Like, ever? And by the way, like I asked that same question in a couple of speeches in front of hundreds, thousands of people, and no one raised their hands. No one has ever seen a completely accurate sales forecast. I haven't even been lucky. I mean, you expect sometimes you get lucky, but no, like, just given, and especially in D2C e-com, there's such fluctuations in demand. Seasonality, competition, marketing spend, there's such fluctuations in how that works. And the ability to minimize the cost of that, or the risk of that, is extremely important. And this is what we're talking about here. Because the longer your lead time is from your production to your fulfillment to your customer, the more of an issue and more costly and inaccurate supply forecast is going to be. If you have to forecast an entire quarter or an entire annual basis, you're going to be wrong all the time. 100% wrong, actually. Like, I guarantee you that. Now, if we take it to the extreme, and this is what we're talking about here, is if you can plan on a weekly basis, then that completely changes the equation. It's still going to be wrong, right? It's going to be less wrong. The cost of being wrong is going to be much lower as well. And we'll talk about some of the actual case studies on that. However, I want to talk a little bit about, I went to business school at Wharton. I took some supply chain classes as well. There were some case studies around Toyota, the Toyota way. Just-in-time manufacturing. Probably read about it to get more details on what that means. But part of the reason why Toyota was so efficient when they were growing fast was because they organized their production on that pull model based on demand down the line. And by demand, it's not necessarily just consumer demand, but when there is demand from the next step in the way, and that actually fluctuates based on the next step in the chain, and they can adjust very quickly. in order to adapt and to be more efficient and save on costs. Now, at the time, it was actually considered to be impossible to enact something like that in traditional logistics chains because you have such a long lead time. If you're using sea freight, for example, regardless of your factory lead time, you're going to have to plan for a month, maybe even more, of just freight lead time. So just in time doesn't really work. It just doesn't work because you're just going to run out. Like it's not going to, you're not going to be able to stock at adequate levels. Now, when you dramatically compress that lead time to a day, that completely changes the game. And by the way, like I'm not just talking about China fulfillment here. Technically, the same concept works if your factory is close to your fulfillment center anywhere. So if your product is produced in the US, then actually this same model does actually work if you have a US fulfillment center. But I'm going to have a guess that most of you aren't actually producing in the US for at least most of your products. Okay. So that's the main concept of the efficiency. And we actually do see efficiency gains of, more or less 10x if you actually do it correctly. Now, I do have two very specific examples of brands that I've been involved in. But let me pause for a second. And Simon, you're the expert in working with factories. You sourced from them before. Maybe you can describe a little bit about like how factories really work. How do their batches work? What capacity constraints that they actually face, and why this also makes sense. And I believe this is actually a win-win situation for the factory as well.
Yeah, it's a huge win-win for both the factory and the seller. This is a misunderstanding because the origin is always a purchase order that's behind the production. And that purchase order has a fixed quantity, fixed price, fixed end date. So if you would change that purchase order into smaller purchase orders, you're solving already some part of the puzzle, right? In that case, that we mentioned this 50,000 pieces, don't buy all the raw materials for these 50,000 pieces, but figure out which one of these raw materials have the longest lead time that is delaying your current production. Because from a factory point of view, they cannot start production if they don't have all the raw materials. I think everyone understands that. If you're waiting for one piece that is going to be, it takes 2 weeks for that to arrive in the factory, you have found your missing link to be able to work towards a demand chain. So then you give that confidence to the factory and you say, your lead time is 30 days. How can I make it 15? So how long does it take you to produce 10,000 pieces? Well, we're producing 2,000 a day, so 5 days. Okay, 5 days to make 10,000 pieces. Perfect. So we can make weekly orders. Yeah, we cannot do because there's this. Okay, tell me the limitation. What is the limitation for you to do it? I need the raw material of that. Okay, how much does it cost? They will be blown away. Most factories never had this conversation, especially if you're dealing with a Chinese factory, they're doing chat-based. It's hard sometimes to get that depth of conversation when you talk to a sales manager who sometimes also doesn't understand well enough how these raw materials are planned and how that is aligned with the production schedule itself. Factories want to have security that the order is going to be finished in time and that you are going to pay for these products. Most of their margin is the export tax refund that they're getting or a little markup. So the risk is huge for them. It's allowing them to become an extension of your business, giving them a mutual understanding that you are giving the commitment, I'm still going to place the 50,000, but I'm going to do this in batches of 10,000. Factories have production lines. Normally, a big factory has a huge hall, multiple machineries. Each machinery is taking care of some piece of the production itself. If you as a seller have an understanding of how the production line is lined up, does it mean that all of the things first need to complete step 1, then everything goes to go to step 2, then everything that's ready needs to go to step 3 until it's in a finished product? Or is it we first do it through here, it immediately goes through the next machine, immediately to the next machine, immediately to the next machine, and then we have a finished product? So how is that cycle lined up? Because if the factory is smaller and they have limited machines, they will first have to clean the machine, change the molds, and then they will do the next part of the production, which is very time consuming if you do this in a batching way, in a production batching way. And therefore, you need to be fully aligned. What are the capabilities of the factory you're working with so that you can align with what works for them? Instead of being, I need these 10,000 And it might be that if they can release 5,000 in 3 days, also fine. If that works better for them and then it works for you as well, that's where you need to get the common ground. And too often it is, here's my PO, what's your best price? And you place the order, finish date, and then you push them, when is it ready, when is it ready, when is it ready? That urgency, that stress factor, which happens all the time with communication with factories, can be actually eliminated if you align on what is it you can do? This is what I want. How can we find common ground? Let's make this happen. And you have a long-term client in me, the e-com seller, and the factory will be happy because they can produce all year long instead of stressing which order they have to produce first, because you're not the only client they're servicing. This is very important. We see this all the time. Like you mentioned, you have two kind of strong cases. So what are the clear case studies that you want to put forward to explain maybe more tangible what this production batching really elevates?
There's three pieces here that I'll use these case studies to go over. One is going to be, how do you optimize for lead time? One is going to be, how do you optimize for cost? And the third, also very, very important, that a lot of people don't realize, how do you actually optimize for your specific factory in terms of the relationship and how they actually operate? And this actually does depend on the factory, the product, and just your requirements as well. So I'm going to give two different examples. One is in consumer electronics and one is in a skincare product that I've been involved in. In consumer electronics, this is something that actually it was Kodi, which is the product that actually was featured on Shark Tank that I was working on before. It is a IoT device with a chipset and also cloud elements as well. So at the time, we were facing, actually the globe was facing chipset shortages. So our lead times were 2.5 months. And I was like, 2.5 months? Like, why? I literally asked our factory owner, it's like, okay, give me the BOM. The BOM is a bill of materials. Okay, like, please specify the cost and the lead times of each individual item. And we realized that it was a chipset that was holding everything up. The chipset had a lead time of 2.5 months. And it was uncertain. It was potentially more than 2.5 months. That's what created the uncertainty. There were some other components, obviously, like the molding and everything like that. I won't go through all the details for this one because there's so many components. However, I realized on the other end that the actual assembly, after all of the components were ready, I actually watched the assembly line after it was produced. It would just take hours. I mean, like, all you need to do for assembly is you don't actually need any like molding or anything. Like, everything is produced already, components are ready, and just goes down the line. And technically, it might take a day or two because you add QC to it. And then I was like, okay, like, what is your run? How much ideally, like, what is your actual minimum run that makes it worthwhile for you, the factory? And they were like, well, because usually our MOQ was like 5,000. But then they were like, well, like, probably 2,000, right? So what we did was we reserved, I think 10 or 15,000 of the chipsets in advance because, like, that was the minimum production run that made sense for them. However, there was no risk for them because the chipsets and other components, they were the actual most expensive pieces of the product itself. This is a nuance of how factories work or how any kind of physical business works, including fulfillment, by the way, is that in a physical business, you have constraints. You have space constraints. You have people constraints. Normally, what a factory does is when a PO comes in for like 50,000 units, like, okay, great, we're making money again, but now I got to like hire overtime. I got to hire additional part-time laborers because otherwise they can't produce more than like 5,000 per day. It actually affects the factory's ability to plan accordingly as well. So especially if you're working with more kind of a smaller or medium sized, but still good factory, a lot of times, and this is where you have to talk to the factory on how they actually operate. A lot of times they'll actually prefer to pre-stock materials, obviously, but they actually prefer to push out, let's say 2,000 at a time or 5,000 in a week. Because then they can actually, you're not pushing them to get 50,000 units out like tomorrow, and you're actually doing batches at a time. And this applies to the real benefit of China fulfillment when you have that short lead time, right? This doesn't really work when you have to ship a container because you definitely don't want to ship LCL shipments of 5,000 each every single week. That's extremely inefficient to the US. However, if you're shipping from your factory to China and it takes one day, you can have literally weekly or sometimes daily. We've seen daily replenishment sometimes. A big order, they're trying to get stuff out and the factory wasn't complete and they're sending us 6,000 every single day to fulfill spikes in demand. And actually, a factory prefers that. versus like trying to rush and have overtime for a larger batch. And we've actually seen situations where, regardless of the PO size, factories can give our clients discounts if they're having that kind of conversation. How do we smoothen out your capacity so we're not trying to rush out like an entire PO in 7 days, but let's spread it out over, 3 weeks and send like, every few days or every week at a time. And that helps out their capacity. And you're getting also plenty enough for your replenishment as well, because you don't need the entire batch at a time because you can just ship it to China. In that same concept, and I want to emphasize why you have to be aware of how your product is different. And your factory is different. On the other hand, I've been working on a skincare brand as well. And in skincare, there's actually less components. The components are basically box, bottle, and raw materials, and then the filling of the product itself. So in the skincare example, typically speaking, the blocker is usually the bottles. It's not just the bottles themselves, but it's the printing of the bottles. When you print on a bottle or a tube or a jar or whatever, the way that printing works, it literally doesn't make sense for them to have a lower MOQ than like 5,000 units. Whereas the way that box are printed, you can print out 500, in a few days. Now, it's very hard to get savings on the bottle just because of how like printing works and it's very low margin. However, where you actually can get savings is on the materials. So this is on like the raw materials, because this is where if they purchase 50,000 units worth of raw materials, like the lead times are actually usually not that long for raw materials. However, that's where you can save on costs. And they can store the raw materials for you. And then for the filling part, similar to assembly, they just have to set it up and it takes like a day or so. Now, for the filling part, it's a little bit different than assembly for consumer electronics. They actually have to clean the machines in between, so it's not as simple as just doing one batch at a time. So this is where we have to find a little bit of in between, where we might order like 50 or 1,000 units worth of raw materials for honestly pretty cheap, and then prepare for tens of thousands of jars or bottles. The packaging boxes, we could just print 1,000 at a time. And then we work with the factory on a reasonable schedule, because we do realize there's cleaning in between. So, okay, what is your most ideal situation where they might say, okay, like we can produce 5,000 per week, as opposed to like somehow fluctuating on a daily basis. But that still is a lot better than planning for a quarter or a annual PO at a time. So anyways, I mean, same concept for both. Same potential savings or just added efficiency. And if you think about it that way, it could be really extreme. But again, work with your factory. And part of the thing that I realized that a lot of, especially more ecom brands who might not be working with the factory directly, is that you're just not communicating in the right way. Where they don't expect it. The factories are also used to large POs as well. They get surprised sometimes when you have this level of conversation. They get surprised in a good way when you're working with them to plan for their efficiency as well. And we've had many situations where we have clients who actually get cost savings or better terms. Actually, one of our biggest clients, I think they don't even pay, like they don't have to put out any deposit, right? They just pay after the batches come out, right? And that's because they're working together to also smoothen out the factory capacity as well.
Yeah, so it's not just about the discount, it's actually also the payment terms. Because once you're aligned with the factory and the factory sees you're not just placing one order and never ask them again, you are continuously ordered. There's a reliability towards the factory. So the factory then also gets the confidence, hey, I might as well, because it's going to help the seller grow. If your payments terms in that client case then goes from pay whenever it leaves the warehouse to 2 weeks after it leaves the warehouse, that means the next day or 2 days later, the goods in our warehouse ready to sell and convert into cash. That means you basically don't have to pay for anything you're selling. So you're collecting the revenue before you even pay for most of the goods. That opens up much more cash flow opportunities to invest in your ads, to invest in new products, to invest in optimizations of the product itself. How can I get your better brand out there? How do you build a community? All these kind of services and things you've been running yourself, can I outsource it? Because suddenly you have this frees up capacity where the 10x part, we've seen it happening and still see it happening, from going from 100 orders a day to 1,000 orders a day is not uncommon by just doing production batching. That's why we say in the beginning, It's easily overlooked, but the upside is truly, truly enormous.
Actually, Simon, you brought up something about product improvements, and I want to add to this point too. Is it actually enables you to improve or kind of solve any kind of product issues much faster as well, if you think about it this way. Normally, product improvement cycles or update cycles are like every year, every 2 years, because that's kind of the POs and batches that you're planning around. Now, especially if you're able to separate out different components, you can actually improve components by batch extremely quickly. I'll give you an example. On the skincare brand that I'm working on right now, from the initial first batch, we realized that there's something that's just not perfect with the cap on the tube. It's definitely not perfect. We can say that, okay, well, the next batch, well, actually, we're currently already improving on it. Right. And now we're not pre-purchasing a ton of materials right now because we're still planning to scale up. However, I can see situations where the formulation is perfect. So why don't we just purchase 50,000 units of it? Because it's perfect. There's nothing we're going to change by it. However, we're still testing out the right bottles, the right tubes. So let's go for the 5,000 MOQ, right? And if we see issues on it, the next 5,000, let's change it. Or maybe we see some very critical issue, like it just doesn't work. It's bad, right? Okay, we get rid of the remaining jars. We get rid of whatever component that we've been storing that is not ideal. And like, because like that's such a low percentage of your product COGS anyways, it's way better than having to get rid of a rework like an entire batch of 10,000 or 50,000, right? So this is also what we see. And actually we have clients where using this model and working with factories to constantly improve their batches, they're on their like fifth or sixth iteration over the last like year or 2 years. I mean, again, that's a 10x improvement as well, right? As opposed to improving your product every year, every 2 years, you can do it every 2 months, every batch, if it's even shorter than that. And like, we're not talking about like Gen 2 here. We're not talking about like, the new iPhone 17 Max, right? Like that's not the point here either. Especially when you launch a product, you want to make it high quality, obviously, right? And there's just something wrong with it. Okay, there's battery issues. Let's just change the battery. You have a product that has a zipper. Okay, the zipper has issues. Change the zipper in the next batch. Like, you don't have to retool anything in order to do stuff like that. Again, it depends on your product itself, what it is. I think the biggest point here is understand how the factory works. Talk to your factories. Understand your BOM, your bill of materials, understand your lead times, your components. Where possibly can you actually work with the factory, work with their suppliers to optimize for both ends? And once you create that win-win situation, that's how you can get much higher efficiency for you, much higher efficiency for your factory as well, reduce costs, minimize lead times, and be able to scale up much faster, especially if you're shipping globally.
Yeah, before we wrap this up, I really recommend you to actually, if you have the chance, go visit your factory. I've been in a privilege of visiting hundreds of factories. It just blew my mind understanding how things are being produced that I'm buying normally in a supermarket or in any retail store. It's been for me fascinating just to get that understanding of how a factory works. And if you are not in a position to travel to see your factory, ask them to make a video. It really helps for you to get an understanding. What does my raw material look like? What kind of machines are you using? How many steps are in between? It's maybe not the salesperson you're talking to who will be able to answer it, but I'm sure they're going to help you, because if you're the client and you're paying for the orders, it is something that they are willing to educate you on as well, because not many people are asking. It's about relationship building. And how do you build relationships? By asking valuable questions so that you can be taken seriously going forward. It is factory relationships. It helps. If you show interest, how does it work? Instead of pushing, when is my product ready? Thank you so much for listening to this episode. You can follow us on any podcast channel, on YouTube. Make sure you are following us, but also capturing the value and information we're trying to share here. If you are seeing improvements by just following advice of this episode, please reach out to me, Simon, and I would love to have that conversation and understand how you 10x your business. See you on the next episode.